For roughly 300,000 years, our species walked this planet without leaving a single written word behind. No monuments, no borders, no cities. Just small bands of humans, rarely more than a few dozen, drifting across landscapes that belonged to no one, carrying everything they owned on their backs and everything they knew inside their heads. We call them cavemen. We picture them as brutes, hunched, grunting, gnawing on raw meat in some dark hole, now waiting for civilization to rescue them from their own ignorance. That image is one of the most persistent lies in popular culture, and almost everything your school textbook told you about these people was either incomplete, misleading, or flat out wrong. The story of prehistoric humans is not a story of misery waiting to be solved. It is a story of extraordinary adaptation, of social complexity that rivals anything we have built since, and of a way of life so successful that it lasted over 50 times longer than all of recorded history combined. What follows are 10 facts about these so-called cavemen that most of us were never taught. Facts that do not just correct the record, but fundamentally reshape how we understand what it means to be human. Because the real story of our prehistoric past is not a prelude to the main event. For the vast majority of the human timeline, it was the main event. And we have been reading it wrong. The first correction is the most basic, and it begins with the name itself. The vast majority of prehistoric humans did not live in caves. Caves were used for shelter during extreme cold, for ritual gatherings, for the creation of art that would survive tens of thousands of years. But they were not homes in any meaningful sense. Our ancestors lived overwhelmingly in open-air camps, in carefully constructed shelters made of wood, bone, and animal hides. Gifts positioned near rivers, springs, and migration routes with a strategic precision that would impress a modern urban planner. The reason we associate early humans with caves is a bias of preservation, not of behavior. Organic shelters, wood frames, hide coverings, woven grass, decomposed within decades. Stone endured for millennia. We found the evidence where it survived, and we built our mythology around it. The result was a fundamental distortion. We imagined our ancestors as creatures of darkness, because darkness is where the artifacts lasted. The archaeological record tells a very different story. At Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, a site dating to around 26,000 years ago, researchers uncovered a settlement of multiple huts arranged in a semicircle around a central fire pit, with specialized work areas for tool making, bone carving, and ceramic production, the oldest known ceramics in the world. At Mezhyrich in Ukraine, structures built from the jawbones and tusks of mammoths formed elaborate domed shelters, each requiring the bones of dozens of animals and considerable engineering knowledge to assemble. These were not crude shelters thrown together in desperation. They were designed. The second fact strikes even closer to the mythology. Prehistoric hunter-gatherers were, by virtually every measurable standard, and healthier than the farmers who replaced them. This is not speculation. It is written in the bones themselves. When human populations transitioned to agriculture roughly 12,000 years ago, average height dropped by nearly 5 inches across multiple regions independently. Skeletal remains from early farming communities in the Levant, China, and Mesoamerica show a dramatic increase in dental cavities, from roughly 1 to 2% of teeth among hunter-gatherers to over 16% among early farmers, along with spikes in bone infections, iron deficiency anemia visible as porous lesions on the skull, and repetitive stress injuries in the spine and joints. The physical toll of grinding grain for hours each day, hauling water, and performing the same narrow set of motions from childhood to death was devastating. Hunter-gatherers, by contrast, ate a staggeringly diverse diet, sometimes drawing from over 100 different plant and animal species in a single region, and their bones reflect it. Stronger joints, fewer lesions, denser bone structure, greater overall robustness. The agricultural revolution, which generations of textbooks celebrated as the dawn of progress, was in many ways a catastrophic decline in the quality of daily life for the average human being. We gained surplus. We lost health. This connects directly to a third fact that tends to unsettle modern audiences more than any other. Our prehistoric ancestors worked far less than we do, substantially less. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies Groups like the Hadza of Tanzania, the San people of southern Africa, and the Ashe of Paraguay, who maintain lifestyles broadly analogous to those of our deep ancestors until recent contact, consistently show that adults spend between 15 and 20 hours per week on food acquisition and preparation. The rest of their time is devoted to socializing, storytelling, crafting tools, resting, playing with children, and simply doing nothing at all. Marshall Solins, the anthropologist who first synthesized this data in 1966, called them the original affluent society. Not because they accumulated wealth, but because they desired little and obtained it with remarkable ease. Their needs were finite, and their environment was generous to those who understood it. Wealth could not be stored. Status could not be inherited. Freedom was measured in time. The average Hadza adult, after a few hours of foraging and a brief hunt, returns to camp and spends the afternoon resting, talking, or making arrows. Not because there is nothing to do, but because there is nothing more that needs doing. Compare that to the average modern worker logging 40 to 50 hours per week at a job, adding hours of commuting, and still struggling to feel that the work is done. The idea that civilization freed us from drudgery is, at best, a selective reading of the evidence. But perhaps the most startling revelation concerns what these people could do with their hands and their minds when survival demanded it. Across Europe, South America, and Africa, archaeologists have found skulls bearing unmistakable evidence of trepanation, the deliberate surgical removal of a section of skull bone performed on a living patient. This is brain surgery. It was executed with stone tools, without anesthesia, without antibiotics, without any of the infrastructure we consider essential to modern medicine. And the survival rates were remarkable. At some Neolithic sites in France, and over 80% of trepan skulls show clear signs of bone regrowth around the surgical opening. Definitive proof that the patient survived for months or years after the operation. At Ensisheim in Alsace, a skull dating to approximately 5000 BC shows 2 successful trepanations performed at different times on the same individual, each with extensive healing. The precision of the cuts, smooth, circular, avoiding major blood vessels, suggests not guesswork, but formal training. A transmitted body of knowledge passed from practitioner to practitioner across generations. We were not waiting for civilization to invent medicine. We were already practicing it. The 5th fact requires us to reconsider not just our own species, but our closest evolutionary relatives. For over a century, Neanderthals were portrayed as the dim-witted cousins of Homo sapiens. Physically powerful, but cognitively limited. Outcompeted and driven to extinction by our superior brains. And that narrative has collapsed under the weight of evidence accumulated over the past 2 decades. Neanderthals buried their dead with apparent intentionality, sometimes arranging bodies in specific postures and including what appear to be grave goods, flowers, ochre pigments, animal bones placed with care. They created art. Geometric engravings discovered in Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar have been dated to over 39,000 years ago, predating any confirmed Homo sapiens presence in the region. They crafted complex adhesives by dry distilling birch bark at temperatures that had to be maintained within a narrow range, a process that modern experimental archaeologists struggled to replicate even with full knowledge of the chemistry involved. They made jewelry from eagle talons, they controlled fire with sophistication, and they cared for their injured. The skeleton known as Shanidar I, found in a cave in northern Iraq, belonged to a Neanderthal man who had survived for years with a withered right arm, a crushed left eye socket, and severe damage to his right leg. These injuries were so debilitating that he could not have hunted, gathered, or defended himself without sustained daily help from others in his group. Someone fed him, someone protected him, for years. They did not simply vanish from history. Between 1% and 4% of the DNA of every living person of non-African descent is Neanderthal in origin. We did not just coexist with them, we had children with them. Their legacy is woven into our genome, influencing our immune systems, our skin pigmentation, and possibly even our predisposition to certain diseases. They are not a footnote, they are family. The 6th fact dismantles the assumption that prehistoric people lived in total isolation, confined to the few square miles surrounding their camp. They did not. Long-distance trade networks existed tens of thousands of years before the first city was built. Obsidian sourced from volcanic deposits in central Anatolia has been identified at archaeological sites over 500 miles away, dating to the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 20,000 years ago. Marine shells from the Atlantic coast appear in inland burial sites deep in France and Germany. Baltic amber has been recovered from graves along the Mediterranean. Flint from specific quarries in what is now Poland traveled across half of Europe. These materials did not move by accident. They traveled through networks of exchange that spanned entire subcontinents, passed from group to group across generations, carrying with them not just raw materials, but techniques, symbols, stories, and ideas. Some of these exchange relationships persisted for thousands of years along consistent routes, each suggesting not random encounters, but established partnerships between communities that may never have met face to face, but were nonetheless connected by a chain of mutual dependence. The notion that our ancestors lived in small, disconnected pockets of ignorance is a fantasy. They were networked, the scale was different, the principle was identical. The seventh fact transforms one of the most iconic images of prehistory into something far stranger and more compelling than we were taught. The cave paintings of Lascaux, Altamira, and Chauvet are not primitive decorations. They are among the most sophisticated artistic achievements in human history, and they were almost certainly not created to be looked at in the way we look at art today. Researchers studying the acoustic properties of painted caves have found a striking correlation. The most elaborately decorated chambers tend to be those with the strongest acoustic resonance. Sound bounces in these spaces in ways that amplify, in echo, and distort the human voice, creating an immersive sensory environment unlike anything on the surface. The paintings cluster around points of maximum echo. The chambers are often difficult to access, requiring crawling through narrow passages, descending into total darkness. This was not a gallery. It was a theater, a ritual space where firelight, chanting, percussion, and painted imagery combined to produce an experience that may have been closer to a modern immersive installation than to a museum wall. The pigments were prepared with care from manganese dioxide and iron oxide, mixed with animal fat, and sometimes heated to alter their color. The techniques included blowing pigment through hollow bird bones to create soft gradients, stippling with fingertips, and using the natural contours of the rock surface to give animals a three-dimensional presence that still startles viewers thousands of years later. The paintings at Chauvet are over 30,000 years old. They remain breathtaking by any standard we possess. The eighth fact is perhaps the most quietly powerful of all. Prehistoric communities cared for their vulnerable, not occasionally, not grudgingly, but as a sustained practice evident across hundreds of thousands of years and multiple hominin species. At Dmanisi in Georgia, a skull dating to roughly 1.8 million years ago, belonging not to Homo sapiens but to Homo erectus, shows an elderly individual who had lost all of their teeth years before death. The jawbone had completely resorbed, the alveolar bone smooth and healed over. This person could not have chewed solid food. Someone was preparing soft or pre-processed food for them, consistently, for years. At Windover in Florida, a 7,000-year-old burial site preserved in waterlogged peat, archaeologists found the remains of individuals with spina, bifida, severe arthritis, and debilitating skeletal abnormalities who had clearly been sustained by their communities for extended periods of their lives. They were buried with the same care and the same grave goods as everyone else. Compassion was not invented by civilization. It preceded it by an almost incomprehensible span of time. The ninth fact concerns something so fundamental that we rarely think to question it: what these people ate. The popular image of the caveman tearing into a slab of half-raw mammoth meat is a caricature with almost no basis in evidence. Prehistoric diets were extraordinarily diverse, regionally adapted, seasonally varied, and in many cases surprisingly plant-heavy. Residue analysis from grinding stones dating to over 30,000 years ago reveals that our ancestors were processing wild grains, tubers, and legumes long before anyone thought to plant a seed deliberately. At Border Cave in South Africa, charred remains of starchy rhizomes have been dated to 170,000 years ago. evidence of deliberate cooking at a time when modern humans were still entirely confined to the African continent. Dental calculus, the hardened plaque preserved on ancient teeth, has become a revolutionary source of dietary data. Analysis of calculus from Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens specimens has revealed traces of cooked starches, medicinal plants, including compounds with known anti-inflammatory properties, and even bitter herbs with no caloric value that may have served as remedies for specific ailments. These people understood their botanical environment at a level of detail that most modern humans have entirely lost. The narrowing of human diet to a handful of domesticated crops, wheat, rice, maize, a few animals, was not an expansion of our relationship with food. It was an impoverishment. The 10th and final fact concerns what may be the single most extraordinary achievement of prehistoric humanity, and one that receives almost no attention in standard education. Roughly 65,000 years ago, a group of humans crossed open ocean to reach the continent of Australia. This was not a land bridge crossing during a glacial low stand. Even at the lowest sea levels of the last ice age, the crossing required navigating over 90 kilometers of open water with no land visible on the horizon. A journey that demanded watercraft capable of carrying dozens of people, knowledge of currents and wind patterns, the ability to navigate by stars, all and the collective decision to launch into absolute unknown. This is the earliest confirmed evidence of deliberate ocean voyaging in human history. The people who accomplished it had no metal, no writing, no domesticated animals, no pottery. They reached a continent that no hominin had ever set foot on, adapted to ecosystems radically different from anything in Africa or Southeast Asia, including megafauna found nowhere else on Earth, and established a continuous cultural presence that endures unbroken to this day. The Aboriginal Australians carry the oldest continuous cultural traditions on the planet. Over 60,000 years of uninterrupted connection to land, language, and story. They were not the last to arrive at civilization. They were among the first to master the sea. The image begins to shift. What emerges from the evidence is not a portrait of ignorance rescued by progress, but a portrait of competence that was slowly, incrementally traded away. The transition to agriculture and then to urban civilization brought extraordinary gains. Writing, monumental architecture, political organization, the accumulation of knowledge in libraries rather than in living memory, the ability to coordinate millions of people toward shared goals. These are real achievements, and they should not be diminished, but they came at costs that are only now becoming fully visible to us. Declining physical health, expanding social inequality on a scale that would have been unimaginable to a foraging band, the loss of leisure, the narrowing of diet and skill, the creation of rigid hierarchies that turned the majority of humans into laborers serving systems they did not design and could not leave. For over 95% of our existence as a species, we lived without any of this. We lived in small groups where every member was known by name, where decisions emerged through discussion rather than decree, where the knowledge required for survival was distributed among all rather than hoarded by specialists. That way of life was not a failed experiment abandoned in relief. It was the longest-running success story in the history of life on Earth. It ended not because it was inferior, but because the populations that adopted agriculture grew faster, spread wider, and eventually overwhelmed the landscapes and ecosystems that hunter-gatherers depended on. The farmers did not outthink the foragers. They outnumbered them. And in the logic of population dynamics, numbers are the only argument that matters. What is remarkable is not that the foraging way of life ended. What is remarkable is how long it held. 300,000 years of continuous adaptation, of accumulated ecological knowledge, of social systems flexible enough to survive ice ages, megafaunal extinctions, and the colonization of every habitable continent on Earth. No political system, no empire, no religion has lasted even a fraction of that time. We carry their genes, we carry their instincts, our craving for community, for open sky, for varied movement, for stories told in the dark around a fire. We are the same species that crossed 90 kilometers of open ocean with nothing but wood and courage, that performed brain surgery with sharpened stone, and that painted bison on the walls of Chauvet by the light of a burning torch 30,000 years before anyone thought to build a wall. The distance between us and them is measured in technology,